Bienvenidos. I'd like to welcome everybody to the National Museum of Mexican Art, where we will talk a little bit today about the connection or the role of modern art, Mexican folk art, and of course the marketplace in which these two genres exist. This talk is for the exhibition that will be coming to Chicagoland area, to the Cleve Carney Museum of Art. The exhibit is called Frida, Timeless, and it's definitely an exhibition you should not miss. It's coming from Mexico City, from one of the premier collections of Frida Kahlo's artwork. So today's talk is going to primarily focus around the Mexican Revolution, which was a horrible war that took place from 1910 until 1920. But to really understand the movement of artwork and ideas, we're going to look at the 30 years before the war, sort of the cause of the war. And then from there, we're going to look at the 30 years after the war and see how the arts changed completely and influenced the United States as well as the global art market. Like all history, there are so many different individuals. It's a huge cast of movements and ideas and individuals, but we're going to focus primarily on two, one before the war and one after the war. Before the war, we're looking at Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz is the ruler of Mexico who in different roles controlled the country of Mexico. President at one time, general at another time, and certainly at the end of his 30-year rule, a dictator. Porfirio Diaz, or that era as it's known, the Porfiriato, really saw a lot of changes in Mexico and led to the revolution. In other words, had it not been for some of the strong-handed ideas of Porfirio and his regime, we may not have had a Mexican Revolution in 1910. So Porfirio Diaz and his científicos, his scientists, although they were far from being science, really tried to bring investment to Mexico. And the way they did that is by stamping a lot of the social and the rights of the individuals of Mexico, the indigenous people, the poor people. It was on their backs that he was looking for progress and modernity, right? So the Gilded Era, as we know, had a lot of the same things happening in different parts of the world, certainly throughout the Americas. And so Porfirio thought that the best way to attract foreign investment and economic progress in Mexico is by featuring and highlighting its natural resources, the mines, the agriculture, while at the same time showing that it had a deep, profound culture, right? The well-to-do, the affluent, not only are looking for ways of making money, but obviously ways of enjoying it in a cultured, refined manner. So at that time period, Paris was the capital of the cultural world. So Porfirio Diaz sent artists to study in Paris and come back with the newest modes of expression. One of those artists would have been Diego Rivera, who would have gone off as a young man. And so it was architecture, it was fine art, it was fashion, it was food. They were importing everything they could from France to Mexico. Mexico City at that time looked like a contemporary version of Paris in the Americas. And so what we have is a society that really, the rich benefit, but the poor, obviously, as always, are trampled upon. And eventually, by 1910, said enough is enough and started the Mexican Revolution, the first revolution of the 20th century. As mentioned already, the relationship between the folk art or arte popular in Mexico and the fine art is a very close connection. These three images we see here bring together the ancient indigenous Mesoamerican culture, the popular artist Jose Guadalupe Posada, whose print is right in the middle there, and of course the fine art by Siqueiros, the painter. Standing right in front there is Porfirio Diaz. I love this photo of Porfirio because it really does sort of show, what he was up to. He was very cruel, and the way they treated the living indigenous was horrible. But obviously, he put the ancient civilizations, the Aztecs, up on a pedestal, and again, to sort of show how Mexico has culture. And attract people of means to Mexico. So the Aztec sun, just very briefly, it was carved before the arrival of the Spanish, and then in 1551 it was buried because it was sort of a symbol that the Spanish didn't want the indigenous people to continue to see and remember. Right before the 19th century, it's rediscovered because it had been forgotten. And then it's placed in one of the very first national museums in Mexico. Porfirio Diaz later on recreates a new museum, a national museum of archaeology and history and ethnography, and places this there as sort of a center stone. This piece, by the way, is still on display at the Archaeological Museum in Mexico City. Here we have another view of Porfirio. This is done many years later by Siqueiros. Siqueiros paints this beautiful mural in the Castillo de Chapultepec, and it sort of tells the story of the Porfiriato all the way to the revolution. And so this is the beginning of the mural, and obviously you see very affluent people with their hats, the men and the women, right? Wearing the latest fashions from Paris. The general whispering into his ear along with his científicos and a few other partners in crime, you might say. And down at the bottom, I've put again the Jose Guadalupe Posada print that he created. And it is also meant to represent the well-to-do. It's meant to represent the Gilded Age. And his idea that everybody passes away, right? Death is a great equalizer. Even the women with their fancy hats will one day not need them anymore. The end of the mural ends with the revolution, and as you can see, we have a whole different cast here, cast of characters. We have the workers, we have the campesinos, the poor indigenous, the laborers, and the masses. And you can obviously, he compares them or contrasts them by the way they're dressed with their missions. The mission of revolution. During this time and soon after, Mexico really attracted many individuals, artists particularly. Tina Modotti was one of them. From Italy, she's a photographer. She documents so much of what she sees soon after the revolution in Mexico, and of course documents her friends who are the arts people. I love this photo because again, you get a sense of with these hats that were used for working in the sun, you get a sense of the masses, you get a sense of the campesinos, you get a sense that the people who were in the rural parts of Mexico are now also in the cities. And then the photograph on the left clearly not only has images of people of corn and work and revolution, but also ideas of socialism and communism that were very popular in Mexico at the time. This is one of my favorite photographs by Siqueiros because he's really looking at the ancient and the present. So in the 1930s, 1940s, it was very clear that the campesinos were of indigenous ancestry. And so I've placed this a similar mask on the right, just so you can see some of the source material that the artists were looking at. let's not forget that at this time, modern art was looking at ancient civilizations for its creativity, for its inspiration. We had Pablo Picasso looking at Africa. We had Gauguin looking at Tahiti, and of course the Mexican artists just had to look into their backyard at all the ancient civilizations. But at the same time, and this is, I guess, part of what this painting is about, that they are still part of the present, that they are still part of the fabric of the nation of Mexico, and that they continue. So with this painting, I think Siqueiros makes a very strong statement about the past and the present being still a part of the fabric of Mexico. Here's a small ancient piece that I just wanted to share with you. It's from West Mexico. West Mexico has different groups, different communities, different indigenous people from different times. They all have a very unique character as to how they make their work, but they're grouped together and known as West Mexico. So when I say West Mexico in the future, just know that it's the Nayarit, the Colima, the Chupiquaro, and different indigenous groups from that area. I love this little piece because it does have a strong connection to current day popular art or folk art. It's a piece that is meant to depict a serene scene, right? We see a house. There are birds on top. There's a dog somewhere in there, and it almost looks like there's a conversation. You could almost eavesdrop and hear what's going on as they're sort of recounting the day's activities, whether this be in the early morning or in the evening at sunset. It gives us a great understanding, and it makes us able to imagine life in ancient Mexico, not too different from life in contemporary rural Mexico. These West Mexico ceramics, by the way, they're really delightful pieces to look at. They're very tranquil, they're quiet, they're engaging. Unlike many of the other cultures in Mexico, whether it's the Aztecs or the Toltecas, that oftentimes depicted war gods, warriors, things like that. The West Mexico pieces are frequently tranquil, quiet scenes of everyday life, and that is definitely has a strong connection with the folk art of Mexico. I had mentioned earlier that during the Porfiriato, many artists were sent to Mexico to study the latest trends in the modern art movements. Diego Rivera was there from like 1908 until right after the war ended to 1921. He studied Cubism, he studied Impressionism. Some of his work is like Cézanne, some of it's like Picasso. He lived in Spain, he lived in France, and then before he came back to Mexico in 21, he traveled throughout Italy and learned frescoes, which comes in very handy once the revolution is over. This is a photograph taken by Tina Modotti, remember the photographer that I mentioned earlier. She photographed this early mural of Diego Rivera. It's called Arsenal. Her photograph is called Distributing Arms because she's focused on the central panel here. And in the scene is not only a lot of bustling activity and ideas of revolution and people starting to gather and mass together to revolt against the Porfiriato, but he also includes a few people that we should recognize. Of course, at the center is his Frida. This would have been one of the first times that Diego uses or portrays Frida in one of his works of art. On the left is Siqueiros, the painter whose work we just saw. All the way on the right is Tina Modotti herself, and she's looking lovingly into her romantic interest at the time, Julio Mela. Julio Mela was a communist from Cuba, and behind him, or I should say next to him in the dark hat, is Vittorio Vidal. And interesting story is that Julio is assassinated, and people believe that it was Victoria who did it, and this is part of a little love triangle that was happening with Tina Modotti, who first dated Julio and then Vittorio. But besides all this are also a lot of politics. We won't go into it now, but just know that these individuals were communists. They were in Mexico for political reasons, and the arts and politics were pulled together very closely during this time period. This is just a close-up color version of that same mural, just so you could see it in color, especially Frida, who was actually introduced to Diego Rivera by Tina Modotti. Diego and Frida, they collected and they had popular art throughout their homes, throughout their studios. These are Judas figures. They are large paper mache pieces. Actually, they're Carton Area, which is a little bit different than paper mache. But you can see them in both of these images of the two artists. The Judas figures are used in celebrations in Mexico, particular in Mexico City, and it makes sense that Diego would have included these kinds of works in his murals and his frescoes, being very familiar with the traditions of Mexico City. It doesn't make sense that he would be necessarily depicting rituals and celebrations from the small towns. He was from the large city, and so knew what happens in the different neighborhoods. By the way, the Judas figures on the right-hand side, you see an image of Semana Santa, which is Holy Week in Mexico, when they blow up these Judas figures. They are images of politicians. They are icons of life and death and rulership. They are strapped with fireworks and they explode. They blow them up during Semana Santa, during Holy Week. And as they're blowing up, because they're so light and made of cardboard and bamboo, it looks like they're dancing. They start dancing around, jumping around with the explosions of the fireworks. On the left is an image of the festival of Dia de Muertos, the way it is celebrated in Mexico City during that time period. So again, something that Diego would have seen and been familiar with, just as these scenes that he later puts in a mural of the Alameda Central. The Alameda Central is very much like New York City's Central Park. In the center of this image, of the scene, he puts himself, Diego paints himself as a young boy, Frida, of course, behind him, and holding little Diego's hand is La Catrina. Again, that print by Jose Guadalupe Posada. Posada is depicted right next to her, holding her other hand, and sort of guiding her, I guess, helping her. And then, of course, in the background, throughout the mural, he has people from the history of Mexico. Going from the left to the right is Carmen Diaz. She was the wife of Porfirio Diaz. Sort of behind her is Jose Marti, a Cuban philosopher, poet, writer, and revolutionary who helped lead the independence movement of Cuba against Spain. In the background, on the right-hand side, we have Ricardo Flores Magón, who was an anarchist, along with Librado Rivera, who they sort of ran a newspaper. They were anarchists and were really involved heavily in the revolution against Porfirio Diaz. Okay, and now we look at Coyoacán. I was looking at this photograph up close at Frida in her studio painting. And it's amazing how many things she has around her that are from popular culture. You get the sense that she surrounds herself with these pieces, not merely to decorate her home and studio, but really to inspire her and give her ideas. As usual, she's wearing a huipil in this photograph, which is a blouse that indigenous women from the Tehuantepec area, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, traditionally wear. Very strong women in society, and so wearing this huipil associates Frida with that kind of woman. I believe she also did have family back in Oaxaca. The Dos Fridas painting is on the wall behind her. And then right below the Dos Fridas is a photograph taken by Nicholas Murray in '39. And if you look at the frame, she has embellished it in a very popular traditional folk art way. So she has this great photo of herself in this frame that is very traditional. To the right of the photograph are a few ex votos, very popular in churches. There's a Oaxacan mirror up on the wall behind her. She has a portrait there for the 19th century, and so many West Mexico figures all around of women, of couples, of individuals. But what I really want you to notice also, oh, and there's a small house all the way on the left, similar to the one that we saw earlier, but there's also petates. The petates are those woven mats that are on the floor. You'll see them come up in a few other places, and we'll talk about them in a bit. Actually, we'll talk about them now. There's a petate in Frida's painting here from 1937. This painting is at the Museo Dolores Hormelo, and it was painted by Frida. We don't really necessarily know the family or the story behind it, but the photograph on the right belonged to her. Frida had thousands of photographs that she would use for inspiration or for memory. Photography was something that artists were particularly fond of in the early 20th century, and you can see the relationship between the photo that Frida had of a Niña Muerte, which is that's the tradition of photographing children who have passed away. The tradition was also before photography, was having a painting done of your child who passed away. It was a way of keeping the memory of that child as part of the oral tradition of the family, of not forgetting them. And so oftentimes they were dressed up as a saint or as an angel, and they were commemorated in that way. In Frida's painting, the things that stand out that are different from the photo is the petate. The petate is the woven mat. Indigenous communities use the petate in various ways. They sleep on it, they sit on it and eat. And when they pass away, they're oftentimes wrapped up or rolled in it and then buried. So a petate really is a part of the home, much more than just a rug or a mat would be in today's world. She also includes cempasúchil flowers, which are the flowers that are traditionally used in Day of the Dead. And then, of course, at the very bottom, in a very ex voto style way, she puts down the information on a small sort of piece of paper, right? So she puts down who that is, when that is. And so the ex voto tradition and the angelitos tradition sort of come together in Frida's painting. Here we see Frida, excuse me, here we see Frida just months before she passed away. We know that she passed away in July, but we also know that the photographer passed away in May of this same year. So this is the beginning months of 1954. But again, what I want to point out is the Choloscuintles up on the shelves. Those are the dogs. Those are the Mexican hairless dogs that were oftentimes a part of the burial rituals of ancient Mesoamerican indigenous communities in West Mexico. They believed the dog would sort of guide you into the next life. And so the dog was a spiritual kind of being that helped you process into the afterlife. And we can just see how many of these dogs and these pieces that she has in her home. Here's another painting from Dolores Hormelo Museum that will be on display here in Chicago. And again, I'm just sort of trying to make the relationship that these artists would have had with the ancient pieces. They would have known of the Toltec stone masks that were on display in museums or in many homes at that time. And here it's a way of sort of connecting the present with the past. Here's another piece from West Mexico that would have had a very tender kind of scene of a mother and a child, and Frida certainly would have been very familiar with these icons, these images from the past, as would Diego have been. I love this piece because it really does. It reminds me a little bit of a Diego Rivera painting, the man who's carrying, I believe they're calla lilies or flowers of some sort. And it shows again the connection of the past. This could be a present day person in Mexico working. He's carrying a maguey agave, which as you may know, it's what they use to make tequila and mezcal from. So again, it would have been a reference to a drink that would have been associated with rituals and ceremonies, not necessarily partying, the way tequila maybe is seen today. But it's a piece that really shows how the ancient indigenous were creating these scenes of daily life that were very similar to the present day artisans or traditional artists. They also would depict ceremonies and rituals from everyday life. We can only imagine that this was a way of mourning the dead in ancient West Mexico. And present day ceramics, you can hopefully see the connection. Teodora Blanco is a ceramicist from Oaxaca, from Santa Maria Atzompa, and in her piece here that belonged to the Rockefeller collection, you can see how the spiritual world is still present, right? The animals and the nahuales and the spirits that exist in the world that are not visible but are sort of underlying everyday life. Here's a couple of photos of Mr. Nelson A. Rockefeller, not to be confused with his father, John Rockefeller. As we know, John Rockefeller destroyed Diego Rivera's mural at the Rockefeller Center because of political inclusions of communists. But his son Nelson, who was also a vice president later on in the 70s. So actually, if you look at the photo on the right here, it would have been after his vice presidency under President Ford. And on the left-hand side is when he would have been part of the Secretary of State role. And that would have been in the 40s, in the mid 40s. So this is right afterwards. And that's sort of when he fell in love with Mexico, with ancient indigenous, ancient Mesoamerican works. But then he also saw the connection in the present day, and he started collecting a lot of the folk art or arte popular from Mexico. This is the daughter of the woman that we just saw in the previous photo. Irma continues to work in the traditional way. She continues to work the way her ancestors have worked the clay for generations upon generations. And so we can see here how she sort of carries on this tradition, as does Doña Rosa, who is in this photo here on the left. Doña Rosa is from another town, not too far from Atzompa. She's in Coyotepec, and they're known there for their black clay. On the right-hand side, you can sort of see it's her home kiln that continues to run today. You can see all the wood back there that they burned for that. And the black pottery, by the way, the clay is not black. It turns black in the firing process. Today, there are many artisans or artists in Coyotepec. Here we have Magdalena. She comes from a family that works the black clay from Coyotepec. But you can see now that her work is much more refined. Her work really has transitioned to something beyond folk art and obviously goes to fine art. I hate to keep making these distinctions. I personally feel that both folk art and fine art are their cousins or their siblings. They're from the same family. They grew up in the same way. This is the Martinez family, by the way. We can see Magdalena in this photo here all the way on the right. And everyone in this family works the clay and creates these black clay figures since their children, since their childhood. Oaxaca has a rich tradition of ceramicists and folk artists, traditional artists, maybe we should call them. Josefina Aguilar from Ocotlan, which is not too far from Coyotepec, is another well-known traditional artist. She has been creating figures since she was a young girl. Here's her family. This probably would have been taken in the 90s or the early 2000s. And again, the entire family works ceramics. They all have their own unique style, but yet they all refer back to Josefina's work. Josefina learned from her mother. The story with Isaura is that she used to make traditional plates and bowls and sell them in the market. And one day she was sitting in the market waiting for someone to come by and purchase some of her wares, when she just started creating some of the people that she saw in the market. So at this point, she sort of started transitioning from a utilitarian ceramic object to one that was a little bit more, I guess we could call it decorative, but it was a documentation. These are like photographs. These are snapshots of the people in the marketplace, the way they dress, the way what they do, what they eat, what they use. And so in a way, it goes beyond just being decorative. Sort of like these, right? I'm trying to make the comparison here between the Western Mexico ceramicists, the ancient Mesoamericans, and the way they depicted their daily life, and then the way that they do in present day Mexico. This is a wedding couple, so obviously this is their they're dressed up in special regalia, special traditional ritual objects in their hands, whether one of them has a bowl, the woman has a bowl, and she's wearing beautiful earrings, and the groom seems to have a musical instrument in his hand, something that he's probably playing during the ceremony. Going back to Josefina's early pieces, these were purchased from Rockefeller and belonged to the Rockefeller collection. But again, you can see she has a rosary in one hand. It looks like he maybe has a Bible in the other. So there's obviously something going on here, either a ritual or coming from a special celebration, and it's clearly illustrated in this clay piece. These are other family members. On the right, Guillermina is the sister of Josefina, and you can see how she has all these different images of Frida Kahlo. And on the left is Demetrio. He is Josefina's son. He has completely taken on a whole other style that has, fantasy, has otherworldly ideas going on, and it's not just the everyday sort of visions of the marketplace. By the way, I think one of the greatest compliments for Frida is the fact that the traditional artisans have included her in their work. In other words, Frida was first inspired by the folk artists, and then the folk artists were inspired by Frida. This relationship, this yin and yang, this back and forth, I think is very, very strong. And among the creative people in Mexico, there is no difference. It's not that one is better than the other. It's usually just that one is signed and goes off to a different market than the other one. In the 1930s, there were Mexican art exhibits. This is one of the first ones. It traveled the country. You can see at the very bottom, I have highlighted the last venue. Would have been in Chicago at the Art Institute, and there were many pieces. There were over 1,200 pieces in this exhibition that, if you look at the dates, were only on display for about a month at each place. I cannot imagine the installation and deinstallation just a few weeks apart. But anyhow, the piece that is depicted here, that was in the catalog to the book, is a painting by Jose Clemente Orozco. This piece is now at the Art Institute. It's been on display there for many decades, and is without a doubt one of Orozco's best easel paintings ever, and it is of Zapata. You see it's like a dramatic entrance of Zapata into a room of revolutionaries who are waiting. They also included arte popular, such as this incense burner in the display. You can see that this is a ritualistic object. It would have been used for a ceremony. It has an angel at the very top, probably one of the archangels, probably Michael would be my guess. And then years later, we have different pieces here. Again, this is from the Rockefeller collection, from different parts of Mexico. This one is from Puebla, but again, it's a ritualistic object that would have been part of some sort of ceremony in Mexico in the 30s. And you can see the angel there right in the center. That is definitely Michael the Archangel. Other towns, other regions take on this Árbol de la Vida, which means the tree of life, takes on this tradition, but each town sort of has their own take on it, making it uniquely theirs, yet a part of this Árbol de la Vida tradition. So you can tell where it's from, but you know exactly what kind of object it is. The Castillo family from Izúcar de Matamoros in Puebla are probably among the better known family to create trees of life today. And this one, we see the tree of life. It's a candelabra. It has God the Father is sitting at the very top, and at the very bottom would be Adam and Eve. That's the connection with the tree of life idea. The Castillo family also then takes this art form of tree of life to depict and tell other stories. This one is the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. There are 4 apparitions. All 4 of them are depicted here. The one at the very bottom would have been the inside sort of the little niche is the one where Juan Diego opens his tilma, and the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe, is emblazoned on there. The Virgen de Guadalupe, by the way, is the Virgin Mary from the New Testament in the Bible, so the mother of Jesus Christ. There are many other pilgrims, and you walking through here, and different people sort of paying homage, and you can see the Virgin of Guadalupe at the very top. Besides Christian iconography, the Castillo family also celebrates and tells and documents the ancient indigenous. So in this close-up, this detail of another tree of life, you see the founding of Mexico at the bottom, where the cactus is and the eagle is landing to eat the serpent. In the central part is a sacrifice, which would have been an Aztec ritual, and then at the very top are the artifacts left over. Many of these pieces that you see here are of different groups. We have Teotihuacan here. There are, I see, Mayan, indigenous iconography, and so it's sort of a mix of different indigenous groups. But central to them is the Aztec story being told in the middle. Textiles is a huge area. We're going to just kind of go through this a little bit quicker. This is also from the Rockefeller collection, and of course, as we know, the indigenous textiles were a way of celebrating heritage, but also a way of connecting yourself to a specific region or town. Here we have Frida in 1940. She always loved to wear contemporary indigenous clothes. Here are different regions, different towns. People would be able to tell not just where your community is, but exactly where you come from. Ancient indigenous textiles have pretty much disappeared because they rot, they decay, and they do disappear, but they have found some buried in the Templo Mayor. The photo on the left, by the way, are 2 archaeologists along with Carlos Tortolero. He's the the founder and current president of the museum where I work. And then to his right is Matos Moctezuma, who was I believe, the founding director of the Templo Mayor Museo in Mexico City. But I love this piece on the bottom right. It really shows that a lot of the patterns and the way that they are designed have not changed too much. Many people used to believe that these patterns came from architecture. Here we have an example again in Oaxaca of Mitla, and you can sort of see how these patterns are cut into stone, and then how people would then translate that into textiles. Actually, the new ideas, new theories that have come out say that the women who wove came first, and then the people who built and carved the architectural friezes were inspired by them. So it turns out to be quite the other way, right? The women weavers would have had their patterns placed on their huipiles or on their traditional clothing, and then later on, though that's what would have inspired the carvers. The contemporary foot loom is something that came from Spain, and it is used to create or to weave a different kind of rug or textile. These are two examples of Arnulfo Mendoza, whose rugs were rarely, if ever, on the floor. He is somebody who grew up in Teotitlán del Valle, but actually went to Japan and learned textile weaving techniques. He was known to weave gold thread or silver thread into his designs. This is one of his incredible pieces. What would it be? The sun that's being born, the sun that's rising. This was an incredible piece, and of course, by the time he got to the loom, he would have already spent months harvesting the wool, harvesting the cotton, transforming it, and of course, dyeing it by hand in a natural way. Cartoneria is the last sort of branch that we're going to look at, and cartoneria is, again, that paper mache sort of material that is used to make the Judas figures. It was an economic way of creating toys, especially in Mexico City. So here we have Pedro Linares on the right. He was a cartonero, somebody who collected newspapers and cardboard and would make toys for children, such as the Cantinflas figure on the left. They were disposable, they didn't last too long, but they were affordable. And like so many other artists, Pedro Linares was inspired by Jose Guadalupe Posada. Not just the skeletal image of La Catrina, but also his depictions of these kind of demons or monsters or nightmarish figures. Pedro Linares, as the story goes, got sick one day. He had a fever. It was a very serious illness, and he was in bed for a few days with a very high fever. And when he came out of his fever, when the fever broke, he was saying a word over and over and over again. That word is alebrije. As the story goes, he said that he was near his death, and these creatures, these fantastic creatures, really sort of came and saved him and pulled him out of the jaws of death. And they were saying this word that was neither Spanish nor French nor indigenous, and alebrije is kind of like the word that was on his lips when he woke up. And so he right away, being a talented cartonero, he created these pieces, and he started these are other depictions of himself on the left and Frida again on the right by his son Miguel. He started creating these figures of alebrijes. And that's what they called them, alebrijes. The word is not a known word in Spanish or any indigenous language, and it's sort of a combination of different animals. So they bring together deer and fish with scales and feathers and butterfly wings, and these alebrijes really evolved over time from the simpler sort of marketplace of cardboard toys to this alebrije. There's no other way of saying it. The word now is very common in Mexico, by the way. Alebrije, now they make them out of wood, they make them out of metal. It's this fantastic sort of creature. I just saw the other day that there was a new bar in Chicago called Alebrije. So the word is definitely well known now. But this is a piece that's in our collection, and the alebrijes by the Linares family, the children of Pedro Linares, are now all over the world. In closing, I just want to sort of bring together this idea of the popular art and the fine art. In 1969, there was an exhibit in New York City. The Museum of Primitive Art, by the way, was founded in the 50s, late 50s, I believe, by Rockefeller, by Nelson Rockefeller. I'm sure a lot of his pieces were the ones that were on display there. In closing, I want to bring to mind an individual, Magaña. Mardonio Magaña is a man who was born in like the 1860s. He lived through the Porfiriato. He was a campesino. He certainly knew how to use a machete. He certainly knew how to work the land, which is where he lived most of his life. And then right after the revolution, he moved to Mexico City, where he took a job as a doorman at the Casa de los Artistas. And the Casa de los Artistas, many artists would come and go there, and people got to know him and saw what he did. Diego Rivera is probably the most responsible for sort of helping him with his art career. Diego started purchasing his artwork, started supporting him, and Mardonio Magaña continued to create and really refined his work. He was self-taught. Eventually, they had him as a teacher, teaching people how to carve in just a very sort of traditional, natural way. And it is said that Diego Rivera called him the Mexico's greatest contemporary sculptor. So these pieces, by the way, we have 13 of them at the National Museum of Mexican Art in our collection. This was an exhibition of them. But Magaña really is one of these characters, one of these individuals who transitions from a craftsperson, artesano, to artist. He goes from creating pieces that were probably anonymous to creating pieces that have his name. And that is probably the way I will close this presentation, going from the market, meaning the Mercados in Mexico, the local markets, to the art market, which would be the museums and the galleries. Thank you for joining me here at the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood. We're in our main gallery where we have our permanent collection always on display. And as you can see from the display case behind me, we celebrate popular art, arte popular from Mexico. We celebrate the folk art just as much as we do the fine art. For us, they are the same family. They show the same amount of ingenuity and creativity. And there are many families who are represented in this display case here from different parts of Mexico, different materials, different eras and generations. They're part of my history. They're a part of the Mexican culture, and we celebrate them every day here. We hope that you come by. There's going to be a Q&A right after this video is over, where we'll be able to take people's questions and hopefully answer some of them. And again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure sharing our culture, our history with all of you.